A billionaire CEO hired a poor woman as his secretary. She was hiding a devastating secret. Her 5-year-old son was dying of cancer. When he discovered the truth, everything changed, including the man he thought he was. Before we dive in, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city and country in the comments. It's amazing to see our Deep Stories family growing around the world. Now, if you believe in second chances, that cold hearts can learn to love, and that compassion is the ultimate power, hit that subscribe button. This is Alexander and Emma's story, a tale of redemption, unexpected love, and learning what truly matters. Let's begin. Alexander Chen stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office on the 42nd floor, surveying Manhattan like a king overlooking his kingdom. At 35, he had built Chen Technologies into a $10 billion empire through sheer will, ruthless decisions, and an absolute refusal to accept anything less than perfection. His employees called him brilliant. They also called him terrifying. Both were true. You're fired. The words came out cold, clinical, devoid of emotion. His previous secretary, Margaret, had worked for him for 3 years. She had made one mistake, scheduling a meeting for 2 p.m. instead of 2:30. One mistake in 3 years. It didn't matter. In Alexander's world, there was no room for error. Margaret left in tears. Alexander didn't notice. He was already reviewing resumes for her replacement. 20 floors below, in a crowded subway car, Emma Torres clutched her phone with trembling hands. The email had arrived at midnight. Position available. Executive Secretary to CEO, Chen Technologies. Salary, $150,000 per year plus comprehensive health benefits. That last part, health benefits, made her heart race. She read it 3 times to make sure it was real. Emma was 28 years old and had been fighting for 5 years. Fighting to survive. Fighting to save her son. Fighting to keep moving forward when everything in her life screamed to give up. She had worked as a secretary before, at smaller companies with smaller pay choices. But this could change everything. Her phone buzzed. A text from her neighbor, Mrs. Chen. No relation to Alexander Chen, though Emma would find that coincidence darkly funny later. Lucas had a rough night. Fever spiked to 103. I gave him the medicine from the fridge. He's sleeping now. You should come home. Lucas, her 5-year-old son. Her entire world. The reason she was standing in a subway car at 6:30 in the morning, wearing a suit she'd bought at a thrift store, on her way to an interview that could either save them or break her completely. Lucas had acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The words felt like knives every time she thought them. He'd been diagnosed 2 years ago, when he was just 3. 3 years old and fighting cancer. The treatments were brutal. The bills were worse. Emma had health insurance through her previous job, but it covered maybe 40% of the costs. The rest fell on her, and the rest was drowning her. She'd sold everything she owned of value. Her car, her grandmother's jewelry, her college textbooks. She worked her full-time job and then drove for a rideshare service until 2 a.m. most nights. Sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. Neither was food most days. But Lucas got his medicine. Lucas got his treatments. Lucas would survive. He had to. The Chen Technologies building loomed ahead, all glass and steel and intimidating perfection. Emma took a deep breath, straightened her suit jacket. It was slightly too big, but it was clean and professional, and walked inside. The interview was conducted by Alexander's assistant, Jason, a polished young man in an expensive suit who asked Emma about her typing speed, her organizational skills, her ability to work under pressure. She answered everything professionally, hiding the exhaustion that sat like lead in her bones. "Mr. Chen is extremely demanding," Jason said, his tone carefully neutral. His last secretary made one scheduling error and was terminated immediately. He expects perfection, absolute perfection. Can you handle that? Emma thought of Lucas. She thought of the hospital bills stacked on her kitchen table. She thought of the call she'd received last week from the collection agency threatening legal action. She thought of her son's smile, the way he still believed everything would be okay because Mom said so. "Yes," she said firmly. "I can handle that." Jason studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Mr. Chen will see you now." Alexander's office was exactly what Emma expected. Enormous, minimalist, dominated by that wall of windows overlooking the city. And there he was, Alexander Chen himself, sitting behind a desk that probably cost more than Emma's entire annual rent. He didn't look up when she entered. "Sit," he said, still reviewing something on his computer screen. Emma sat. She waited. 1 minute passed, then 2. Finally, Alexander looked up, and Emma got her first clear look at her potential boss. He was handsome in the way powerful men often are. Sharp jawline, perfectly styled dark hair, expensive suit that fit like it had been crafted specifically for his frame, which it probably had been. But his eyes were what struck her. They were dark, intelligent, and completely cold, like looking into the eyes of a machine designed to look human but not quite succeeding. "Your resume is adequate," Alexander said. "Not good, not impressive, adequate. Your references check out. You have experience with calendar management, correspondence, travel arrangements, standard secretarial duties." "Yes, sir," Emma said. "I don't tolerate mistakes," Alexander continued. "I don't tolerate excuses. I don't tolerate personal drama interfering with work performance. Your job is to make my life easier, not harder. Can you do that?" Emma thought of Lucas again. She always thought of Lucas. "Yes, sir, I can." Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying her. Emma felt like a specimen under a microscope. "You look tired," he said finally. It wasn't concern. It was observation, analysis. "Will that affect your performance?" For a split second, Emma wanted to tell him everything. About Lucas, about the cancer, about the bills and the fear and the desperate hope that had brought her here. But she looked into those cold eyes and knew with absolute certainty that this man would not care. This man would see it as a liability and show her the door. "No, sir," she said instead. "It won't affect my performance." Alexander nodded once. "You start Monday, 8 a.m. sharp. Don't be late." Emma stood, managing to keep her legs steady despite the relief flooding through her. "Thank you, Mr. Chen. I won't let you down." He had already turned back to his computer. The interview was over. Emma left his office, made it to the elevator, and only then allowed herself to breathe. She had the job. She had the salary. She had the health insurance. Lucas would get the treatment he needed. They would survive. In his office, Alexander Chen had already forgotten about Emma Torres. She was just another employee, a tool to make his life more efficient. Nothing more. He had no idea that hiring her would change everything. Emma's first week at Chen Technologies was exactly as brutal as Jason had warned. Alexander Chen was not a man who believed in easing new employees into their roles. On her first day, he handed her a list of 17 tasks that needed to be completed by end of business. On her second day, the list was 23 items long. By Friday, Emma was managing his entire schedule, coordinating 3 different international business trips, and somehow still finding time to prepare the detailed briefing documents Alexander required before every meeting. She arrived at 7:30 every morning. She left at exactly 6 p.m., never a minute later, gathering her things in a rush that bordered on panic. Alexander noticed this. He noticed everything. "You leave at 6 on the dot," he commented one evening as Emma was packing her bag, her movements sharp with urgency. Every single day. 6 p.m. exactly. Why?" Emma's hands froze for just a moment. "I have a commitment, sir. A personal commitment. It doesn't interfere with my work. I complete everything you assign." "That's not what I asked," Alexander said, his tone carrying that edge that made employees throughout the building nervous. "I asked why." Emma met his eyes. She'd learned in her first week that Alexander Chen respected directness, even if he didn't particularly care about the answer. "Family matters, sir. It's handled before work and after work. It doesn't affect my performance here." Alexander studied her, then turned back to his computer. See that it doesn't. What Emma didn't know was that Alexander had already noticed other things about her. Small things. Strange things. She never joined the other secretaries for lunch. Instead, she ate granola bars at her desk while working. She drank only water, never the expensive coffee from the break room. Her clothes, while professional, were clearly budget purchases, and those shadows under her eyes got darker with each passing week. Alexander Chen did not believe in concerning himself with his employees' personal lives. Their problems were not his problems. And yet, he found himself watching Emma Torres more carefully than he watched most people. 2 months into Emma's employment, Alexander had a breakfast meeting that ran long. He returned to the office at 11 to find Emma on the phone at her desk, her voice low and strained. "I understand that, but I sent the payment last week," she was saying. "It should have posted by—" "Yes, I know it's overdue, but I'm—" She saw Alexander and immediately straightened. "I have to go. I'll call back during lunch." She hung up quickly, her professional mask sliding instantly into place. "Mr. Chen, your 11:30 with the board has been moved to the large conference room. I've already sent the updated location to all attendees." Alexander nodded, said nothing, walked into his office. But he'd heard enough of that conversation. Emma Torres had money problems, severe ones from the sound of it. That explained the budget clothes, the granola bar lunches, the exhaustion. It didn't explain why someone with money problems would leave work at exactly 6 p.m. every single day instead of taking advantage of overtime opportunities. That evening, Alexander did something he rarely did. He stayed late, past 6 p.m., past 7, working on a merger proposal that needed his personal attention. At 6:15, he heard Emma's hurried footsteps in the hallway, heard the elevator ding, heard her leave. At 6:45, his private line rang. Only a handful of people had that number. Alexander frowned and answered. "Chen? Mr. Chen, this is St. Catherine's Hospital calling about your employee, Emma Torres. We have you listed as her emergency contact." Alexander's frown deepened. "That must be an error. I'm her employer, not her emergency contact. Our records show you were added 3 days ago. Sir, Ms. Torres is currently in our pediatric oncology ward with her son, Lucas. There's been a complication with his treatment, and we need to discuss." Alexander hung up. Then, without quite understanding why, he grabbed his coat and left his office. St. Catherine's Hospital was a 20-minute drive from Chen Technologies. Alexander made it in 12. He found the pediatric oncology ward on the 4th floor, and that's where he saw Emma Torres for the first time, outside of the carefully professional mask she wore at work. She was sitting in a waiting room chair, her professional blazer discarded, her blouse wrinkled, her hair falling out of its neat bun, and she was crying. Not the delicate, controlled crying of someone trying to maintain composure. Real crying. The kind of desperate, terrified crying that came from a place of absolute helplessness. Alexander stood in the doorway, suddenly aware he was intruding on something intensely private. He should leave. This was not his concern. Emma Torres's personal life was not his business. And yet he found himself walking into the waiting room, found himself sitting in the chair next to her. Emma looked up, saw him, and the shock on her face would have been almost funny in any other circumstance. "Mr. Chen? How did you—" "The hospital called me," Alexander said. "He didn't mention that they'd used an emergency contact he hadn't authorized. Your son, Lucas, cancer?" Emma's face crumpled. She tried to control it, tried to put that professional mask back on, but she couldn't. "Not here. Not now. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia," she whispered. "He's 5 years old. He's been fighting for 2 years. Tonight he had a reaction to the treatment. They said—" Her voice broke. "They said his body might be giving up." Alexander sat there, this man who prided himself on never letting emotions interfere with logic, and felt something crack in the carefully constructed walls around his heart. "Is that why you leave at 6? Emma nodded, wiping at her tears uselessly. "They kept coming. I have to pick him up from my neighbor's house. She watches him during the day, but she's elderly, and Lucas needs his mother. He needs—" She took a shuddering breath. "He needs me to be there, even though I'm failing him, even though I can't afford the treatments he needs, even though I'm not enough." "You took the job for the health insurance," Alexander said. "It wasn't a question. The salary helped too," Emma said with a bitter laugh. "But yes, the health insurance. Your company has one of the best health plans in the city. It covers 70% of Lucas's treatment costs. Without it, we'd be... She couldn't finish. Alexander Chen sat in that hospital waiting room, surrounded by the beeping of machines and the quiet desperation of parents trying to save their children. and made a decision that would change everything. "Take tomorrow off," he said. "Paid. Stay with your son. I'll handle your duties." Emma stared at him like he'd grown a second head. "Mr. Chen, I can't." "You can and you will," Alexander said, standing. "That's an order from your employer. Stay with Lucas. I'll see you when he's stable." He left before Emma could respond, before he could examine too closely why he'd just done something so completely out of character for him. He drove back to his office, sat at his desk, and opened his computer. By morning, Alexander had arranged for Chen Technologies to partner with St. Catherine's Hospital on a new initiative, fully funded treatment for children of company employees with life-threatening illnesses. The board would question it in the morning. Alexander didn't care. He'd push it through anyway. He'd also done something else. Something he told himself was purely practical, nothing to do with Emma Torres specifically. He'd personally reviewed her health insurance coverage and upgraded it, not just for her, for all executive assistants. That was what he told himself. It was company-wide. It had nothing to do with one exhausted single mother trying to save her dying son. When Emma returned to work 3 days later, Lucas stable for now, she found a letter on her desk. Her health insurance had been upgraded to the premium plan. 100% coverage for all treatments. No copays, no deductibles, no limits. She also found that the mysterious quarterly bonus she received had tripled. She found that Chen Technologies had suddenly implemented a new family emergency policy, allowing employees unlimited paid time off for medical emergencies. She found a lot of things that seemed too perfectly timed to be coincidence. But when she went to Alexander's office to thank him, to ask him if he'd had something to do with these sudden changes, he looked at her with those same cold eyes and said, "I don't know what you're talking about." "Get back to work, Ms. Torres. I have a meeting with London in 10 minutes. Emma left his office, but she wasn't stupid. She knew what Alexander Chen had done. She knew he was responsible for every change that had suddenly made her son's treatment possible, and she knew he would never admit it. For the first time since she'd started working at Chen Technologies, Emma Torres looked at her boss and saw something other than a cold, ruthless businessman. She saw something human. She just didn't know yet that he'd been human all along. He'd just forgotten how to show it. Over the next 3 months, something shifted between Alexander Chen and Emma Torres. It was subtle at first. So subtle that neither of them could pinpoint exactly when it started. But it was there, growing stronger each day. Alexander began asking Emma to work late on certain projects. Not as a burden, he always made sure she'd arranged for Lucas's care first, but because he valued her input. Emma, who had a degree in business from a state school she'd attended on scholarship, had insights that surprised him. She saw angles he missed. She asked questions that made him reconsider decisions. "The Tokyo merger," Emma said one evening as they reviewed documents in his office. It was 7 p.m. Lucas was having a good week, and Emma's neighbor had agreed to watch him overnight. "You're planning to cut 200 jobs in their manufacturing division. Have you considered retaining 50 of those positions and reallocating them to research and development instead?" Alexander looked up from the contract he was reading. "That would reduce our profit margin by 3%. In the first year," Emma agreed. "But their R&D department has been developing a new processing chip that could revolutionize the entire industry. If we invest in that instead of cutting it, we could see a return of 15 to 20% within 3 years. Alexander studied the numbers Emma pulled up on her tablet. She was right. He'd been so focused on immediate returns that he'd missed the long-term opportunity. "How did you know about the processing chip?" Emma smiled slightly. "I read the quarterly reports. All of them. Not just the executive summaries." Alexander found himself smiling back. When was the last time he'd smiled at work? "Remind me to give you another raise." "You gave me one last month," Emma pointed out. "Then remind me to give you 2 raises," Alexander said. And for a moment, they just looked at each other, and something passed between them that neither would acknowledge out loud. These moments happened more and more frequently. Emma working late with Alexander, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Alexander asking Emma's opinion on decisions he would normally make alone. Long conversations about business strategy that somehow turned into conversations about life, about values, about what actually mattered. "Why did you build this company?" Emma asked him one night. They were alone in his office, the city lights glittering below them, a half-eaten order of Chinese takeout between them. Alexander had insisted on ordering dinner when he realized Emma hadn't eaten all day. Alexander was quiet for a long moment. "My father worked in a factory," he said finally. "He worked 60 hours a week for 30 years and died at 53 from a heart attack at his workstation. The company gave my mother a fruit basket and hired his replacement the next day." Emma said nothing, just listened. "I built this company so I would never be powerless like that," Alexander continued. "So I would never be disposable. So I would be the one with the power to make decisions, not the one whose life was decided by people who saw him as just another number." "But now you're the person with the power," Emma said softly. "What do you do with it?" Alexander looked at her, really looked at her. Emma Torres, who came to work every day despite being exhausted, despite barely surviving financially, despite carrying a burden that would have broken most people. Emma Torres, who loved her son with a ferocity that terrified and inspired him. Emma Torres, who somehow still believed that good things could happen in a world that had given her every reason to stop. Believing. "I'm figuring that out," he said. The turning point came on a Tuesday in March. Lucas had another crisis. Emma called Alexander from the hospital, her voice shaking. "Mr. Chen, I know I've taken a lot of time off recently, but Lucas he needs—" "I'm on my way," Alexander interrupted. "What?" "No, Mr. Chen, I wasn't asking you to— I'm on my way," Alexander repeated, already grabbing his coat. "Text me which hospital." He arrived 30 minutes later to find Emma in that same waiting room where he'd found her months ago. But this time, when he sat down next to her, she didn't try to hide her fear. She leaned into him, and without thinking, Alexander put his arm around her shoulders. "They're running tests," Emma whispered. "His counts are dropping. They might need to try a different treatment protocol, but it's experimental and expensive and—" "Cost doesn't matter," Alexander said firmly. "Whatever Lucas needs, he gets. I don't care what it costs." Emma pulled back to look at him. "Mr. Chen—" "Alexander," he said. "My name is Alexander, and I mean it, Emma. Whatever Lucas needs." "Why?" Emma asked, and there were tears in her eyes, but she held his gaze. "Why do you care so much? He's not your son. I'm just your secretary. Why would you—" "You're not just my secretary," Alexander said, and in that moment, in that hospital waiting room with the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the smell of antiseptic in the air, he finally admitted what he'd been avoiding for months. "You haven't been just my secretary for a long time." Emma stared at him. Alexander stared back. The admission hung between them, too big to take back, too true to deny. A doctor emerged before either of them could say anything more. "Miss Torres? We have Lucas's results." Emma stood immediately, and Alexander stood with her. The doctor looked surprised to see him there, but said nothing. "Lucas's counts are critically low. We need to start him on the experimental treatment immediately. It's aggressive, but it's his best chance." "The cost will be approved," Alexander said before the doctor could finish. "Whatever it takes. Start the treatment." The doctor nodded and disappeared back through the double doors. Emma turned to Alexander, and something in her expression made his breath catch. "You just authorized treatment without even knowing the cost," she said. "I know," Alexander replied. "You just made a financial decision without reviewing any data or projections." "I know. You just put another person's needs above your own interests." "I know," Alexander said again, and then softer. "I'm learning." Emma stepped closer to him. In the harsh hospital lighting, she could see every line of stress on his face, every shadow under his eyes that matched her own. Alexander Chen, the ruthless CEO who fired people for single mistakes, who never let emotions interfere with business, who had built his entire life around control and power. And here he was, in a hospital waiting room, authorizing experimental treatments without knowing the cost, for a child who wasn't even his. "When did this happen?" Emma asked quietly. "When did what happen? When did you stop being the man who fired his secretary for a scheduling error and become the man standing in front of me right now?" Alexander reached up and gently tucked a strand of hair behind Emma's ear, a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. I think it happened the first time I saw you cry over your son and realized that I would do anything to make sure you never had to cry like that again. They stood there in the waiting room, surrounded by other families fighting their own battles, and let themselves acknowledge what had been growing between them for months. This wasn't about employer and employee anymore. This hadn't been about that for a long time. Alexander, Emma whispered, and it was the first time she'd used his first name. I'm not sure we should— I know, he interrupted gently. I know it's complicated. I'm your boss. You're dealing with Lucas's illness. The timing is terrible. The power dynamic is problematic. I know all of that. Then why are you looking at me like that? Because, Alexander said simply, sometimes the logical thing and the right thing aren't the same, and I'm tired of always choosing logic. Before Emma could respond, her phone buzzed. A text from the hospital staff. Lucas is asking for you. Room 412. Go, Alexander said, stepping back. Be with your son. I'll handle everything else. Emma hesitated, then stood on her toes and kissed his cheek. A brief, gentle kiss that somehow changed everything. Thank you, she whispered. For all of it. For everything. She disappeared through the double doors, leaving Alexander alone in the waiting room. He sat back down in that uncomfortable plastic chair and realized that for the first time in his adult life, he was exactly where he wanted to be. Not in a boardroom, not closing a merger, not accumulating more power or wealth, right here, in a hospital, waiting for news about a 5-year-old boy he'd never met but cared about deeply, because that boy's mother had somehow become the most important person in his life. Alexander Chen, the man who thought he had everything figured out, smiled to himself in that empty waiting room. He didn't have anything figured out, and for the first time in his life, that was perfectly okay. The experimental treatment was brutal. Lucas's tiny body fought against the aggressive therapy, and for 3 weeks it wasn't clear if he would survive. Emma took a leave of absence from work, fully paid, Alexander had insisted, and practically lived at the hospital. Alexander visited every day after work, bringing food that Emma never remembered to eat, sitting with her in the waiting room when she needed someone to just be there. On the 17th day of treatment, Lucas turned a corner. His count started improving. The color came back to his cheeks. He started smiling again, started asking when he could go home, started being a 5-year-old boy instead of a cancer patient. The day the doctors declared Lucas in remission, Emma broke down completely. She'd held it together through 2 years of terrifying diagnosis, brutal treatments, and desperate hope. But now, finally, when she knew her son would survive, she couldn't hold it in anymore. Alexander found her in the hospital chapel, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. He sat next to her, pulled her into his arms, and let her cry until she had nothing left. And then, in the quiet that followed, Emma said something that changed everything again. I love you. The words hung in the air between them. Emma pulled back, looking up at Alexander with red-rimmed eyes, and repeated them. I love you, Alexander Chen. I don't know when it happened. I don't know how it happened. I just know that I do. And I needed to say it. Alexander's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb gently wiping away her tears. Emma, you don't have to say it back, Emma said quickly. I know it's complicated. I know I work for you. I know the timing is— I love you too, Alexander interrupted, and the words felt like finally exhaling after holding his breath for months. I have for a while now. I didn't know how to say it. I didn't know if I should. Why not? Because loving someone means being vulnerable, Alexander said quietly. It means giving them power over you. And I built my entire life around never being powerless. Emma smiled through her tears. And now, Alexander said, leaning his forehead against hers, I'm realizing that some kinds of powerlessness are worth it. He kissed her then, gentle and careful and full of all the things they hadn't been able to say to each other for months. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't passionate. It was just right. 2 people who had found each other in the most unexpected circumstances, finally admitting what they both knew was true. When they pulled apart, Emma laughed softly. "This is going to be complicated, isn't it?" "Extremely," Alexander agreed. "HR is going to have a field day. Your board of directors is going to have opinions. Multiple opinions. None of them good. People are going to say, 'I only got involved with you for your money.' People are going to say, 'I took advantage of my position as your employer.'" Alexander countered. Emma looked at him seriously. "Can we handle that, all of it? The complications and the opinions and the judgment?" Alexander thought about it, really thought about it. A year ago, he would have said no. A year ago, he would have chosen the path of least resistance, would have protected his reputation above all else. But that was before Emma Torres walked into his life and showed him that there were things more important than power and control. "Yes," he said firmly. "We can handle it, together." Over the next 6 months, they proved that they could. Emma officially resigned as Alexander's secretary. Insisted on it, actually, despite Alexander's protests. HR found her a position as a junior executive in the strategy department, not because of Alexander. Because Emma Torres was brilliant and had been wasting her talents as a secretary, she excelled in her new role. Within 3 months, she was promoted to senior executive. Within 6 months, she was leading her own team and presenting strategies to the board. The old guard raised eyebrows, some because of her relationship with Alexander, but most because she was a young woman without an Ivy League pedigree rising through the ranks faster than they thought proper. Alexander shut down every whisper, every insinuation, with cold efficiency. Emma Torres had earned her position through merit, and anyone who suggested otherwise would find themselves very quickly unemployed. But the real test came when Lucas needed a bone marrow transplant. The remission had been temporary. The cancer was back, more aggressive than before, and this time, the only thing that would save him was a transplant. Emma was tested first. Not a match. They started searching for donors in the registry. No matches. They tested family members, Emma's parents, her sister. Nothing. With each negative result, the fear grew stronger. Lucas needed this transplant, and time was running out. "Test me," Alexander said one night as they sat in Emma's apartment. Lucas asleep in his room. Emma looked up from the medical forms she'd been reviewing. "What?" "Test me," Alexander repeated. "For the bone marrow match." "Test me." "Alexander, the odds of you being a match are—" "I don't care about the odds," Alexander interrupted. "Test me, please." So Emma did. And 3 weeks later, they got the call that seemed impossible. Alexander Chen was a perfect match for Lucas Torres. 6 out of 6 markers. The doctor said they'd seen maybe 3 cases like this in their entire career. It was almost unheard of for a non-relative to be such a perfect match. Emma stared at the results, tears streaming down her face. Alexander looked at her, then at the medical forms in her hands, and said the only thing that mattered. "When do we schedule the surgery?" The transplant was scheduled for October 15th. Alexander took a full week off work, something he'd never done in his entire career, to prepare and recover. The surgery itself was relatively simple for him, but it would save Lucas's life. The night before the surgery, Emma and Alexander sat on her couch, Lucas asleep between them, his small head resting on Alexander's chest. Alexander's hand stroked the boy's hair gently, and Emma watched them together. This man and this child, who weren't related by blood, but who were about to be connected in the most profound way possible. "You know what I realized?" Emma said softly. "What?" "A year ago, I thought you were the coldest, most ruthless person I'd ever met." Alexander smiled slightly. "And now I know you're the most loving person I've ever met. You just forgot how to show it until we came along." Alexander looked down at Lucas, this brave little boy who had fought so hard for so long, and then at Emma, this incredible woman who had shown him what really mattered. "You both saved me," he said quietly. "I was succeeding at everything and living for nothing. You gave me something to live for. The surgery went perfectly." Alexander was awake and back to work remotely within 3 days, much to his doctor's frustration. Lucas's body accepted the new bone marrow without complications. 3 months later, Lucas was declared cancer-free. 6 months later, the doctor said the transplant had worked. Lucas would survive. And through it all, Alexander and Emma built something neither of them had expected to find: a family. On a Saturday morning in April, 1 year after Lucas's transplant, Alexander took Emma and Lucas to the park. It was a perfectly ordinary spring day. Lucas ran ahead on the path, his energy boundless now, his laughter echoing through the trees. Emma walked beside Alexander, their fingers intertwined. "Emma Torres," Alexander said suddenly, stopping on the path. Emma turned to look at him, and her breath caught when she saw him kneeling in front of her. In his hand was a small velvet box. "A year ago, you walked into my office for a job interview," Alexander said. "You needed health insurance for your son. I needed a secretary who wouldn't make mistakes. It was supposed to be a simple transaction. Nothing more." Tears were already streaming down Emma's face. "But you didn't just become my secretary," Alexander continued. "You became my conscience, my purpose, my home. You taught me that success isn't measured in profit margins or company valuations. It's measured in the people you love and the difference you make in their lives." He opened the box, revealing a ring that was beautiful but not ostentatious, exactly Emma's style. "Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you?" Emma dropped to her knees in front of him, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes," she said. "Yes, of course, yes." Alexander slipped the ring on her finger, and they kissed there in the middle of the park path while Lucas ran back to them, saw what was happening, and let out a whoop of joy that made other park-goers smile. "Are you going to be my dad now?" Lucas asked, launching himself at Alexander. Alexander caught him, held him close, and said, "If you'll have me." "I already had you," Lucas said matter-of-factly. "You gave me your bone marrow." "That means we're already family." And he was right. They were already family. They had been from the moment Alexander Chen stopped being the cold, ruthless CEO and became the man who would do anything for the people he loved. They were married 6 months later in a small ceremony at St. Catherine's Hospital, in the same chapel where Emma had told Alexander she loved him for the first time. Lucas was the ring-bearer and took his job very seriously. Emma wore a simple white dress that made Alexander's breath catch. Alexander wore his best suit and cried during the vows, something the old Alexander Chen would have considered a weakness. The new Alexander Chen knew it was strength. 5 years after their wedding, Emma Chen stood on the stage of Chen Technologies' annual conference, addressing an auditorium filled with 3,000 employees. Her title now was Executive Vice President of Strategic Development. She'd earned that position through years of hard work, innovative ideas, and a perspective that came from understanding what it meant to struggle. "When I first came to Chen Technologies 7 years ago," Emma said to the hushed audience, "I was desperate. I was a single mother with a dying son and no options left. I took a job here because I needed health insurance. I expected a paycheck. What I got was a family." In the front row, Alexander sat next to Lucas, now 11 years old and healthy, his cancer-free status marked at 6 years and counting. Lucas was already showing signs of his stepfather's business acumen, asking questions about company operations that made Alexander smile. "This company has transformed," Emma continued, "from a place focused solely on profit margins to an organization that understands business success and human compassion aren't mutually exclusive. We now have the most comprehensive employee health benefits in the industry. We have unlimited paid leave for family medical emergencies. We fully fund cancer treatment for employees' children. And our profit margins have increased by 43% since we implemented these policies." The audience applauded. Alexander watched his wife command the stage with the same awe he'd felt that first time she'd challenged his perspective on the Tokyo merger. She was magnificent. She always had been. He'd just been too blind to see it immediately. After the conference, the three of them walked through the building together. Employees greeted Emma warmly, without the fear that had once characterized interactions with leadership. Alexander had learned from Emma that respect born from fear wasn't really respect at all. "Mom, can we stop by the pediatric ward on the way home?" Lucas asked. "I promised Jeremy I'd visit today," Emma smiled. Jeremy was one of the children currently receiving treatment through the company's medical program, the program Alexander had created 7 years ago after seeing Emma cry in that hospital waiting room. Lucas, who had fought his own battle with cancer, now spent his free time visiting other children going through treatment, bringing them toys and hope in equal measure. Of course, sweetheart, Emma said. I'll come too, Alexander added. I need to speak with the hospital director about expanding the program. Lucas beamed. At 11, he already understood he'd been given something precious, life, when it could have easily been taken away. And he understood that his dad, not stepdad, never stepdad, just dad, had been part of saving him. The bone marrow transplant that had given Lucas his life had also given Alexander something he'd never expected: a son. That evening, after visiting the hospital and having dinner as a family, Emma's cooking had improved significantly over the years. Much to everyone's relief, Alexander and Emma sat on their balcony overlooking the city. Lucas was inside doing homework, grumbling about math problems, but dutifully working through them. Do you ever think about how different our lives could have been? Emma asked, leaning against Alexander's shoulder. Every day, Alexander admitted. If I hadn't hired you. If I hadn't happened to stay late that night and taken the hospital's call. If I'd chosen to keep being the man I was, instead of trying to become someone better. You were always someone better, Emma said softly. You just didn't know it yet. Alexander kissed the top of her head. I was a bastard. Let's be honest, Emma laughed. Okay, yes, you were kind of a bastard. But you were a bastard who was capable of change. That's what matters. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the city lights sparkle below them. This view from Alexander's penthouse had once represented everything he thought he wanted, being above everyone else, literally and figuratively. Now it just represented home. I got the test results back today, Emma said suddenly. Alexander straightened, immediately alert. After Lucas's cancer, Emma had been hypervigilant about her own health, getting regular checkups for any sign of illness. And? Emma turned to look at him, a smile playing at her lips. I'm healthy. Very healthy. Healthy enough to be pregnant, apparently. Alexander's world stopped. Pregnant? 8 weeks, Emma confirmed, her smile growing wider. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure everything was okay. But the doctor says everything looks perfect. Alexander stood abruptly, then sat back down, then stood again. We're having a baby? We're having a baby, Emma confirmed. Alexander pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she laughed and told him to ease up. I can't believe it, he whispered into her hair. After everything, after Lucas's illness, after life continues, Emma said simply. That's what I learned through all of this. No matter how dark things get, life finds a way to continue, to grow, to surprise you, they told Lucas at breakfast the next morning. His reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. I'm going to be the best big brother ever. Can we name the baby Batman? No, wait, Optimus Prime? No, wait. We'll discuss names later, Emma laughed. Much later. But definitely not Batman? Lucas asked, hopefully. Definitely not Batman, Alexander confirmed, ruffling his son's hair. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Emma worked up until her final month, much to Alexander's constant worry and fussing. She finally took leave when she couldn't fit behind her desk anymore, joking that the baby had evicted her from her own office. Their daughter was born on a clear October morning, exactly 7 years after Alexander's bone marrow transplant had saved Lucas's life. They named her Grace because Grace was what Alexander had been given when Emma walked into his life. Grace he didn't deserve but received. Anyway, Lucas held his baby sister in the hospital with the seriousness of someone entrusted with precious cargo and whispered to her, I'm your big brother. I'm going to protect you and teach you everything I know. Well, maybe not everything. Some things Dad knows better. But the important stuff, I got you. Alexander stood with his arm around Emma, watching his son cradle his daughter, and felt a completeness he hadn't known was possible. This family, this unexpected, beautiful, complicated family, was everything. Thank you, he whispered to Emma. For what? For walking into my office 7 years ago? For being desperate enough to take a job with a bastard like me? For teaching me what actually matters? For all of it, Emma leaned into him. You saved Lucas's life. You saved mine, Alexander countered. Fair trade. They brought Grace home to a nursery that Lucas had helped decorate with perhaps too many superhero posters. Lucas took his role as big brother seriously, insisting on helping with everything from diaper changes to midnight feedings. Alexander learned that 3 a.m. feedings with his son, both of them exhausted and fumbling with bottles, were some of his favorite moments. Life settled into a new normal. Emma eventually returned to work, though with more flexible hours now. Alexander had learned the art of saying no to business trips that would take him away from his family for too long. Chen Technologies continued to thrive, but it was no longer Alexander's sole focus. It was just his job. His life was at home. On Grace's first birthday, they threw a party in their penthouse apartment. Lucas ran around entertaining Grace's baby friends. Alexander grilled on their terrace while catastrophically overcooking everything. And Emma laughed at his culinary failures while skillfully taking over before he burned down the building. Late that evening, after all the guests had left and both children were asleep, Alexander and Emma stood on their balcony again, looking out at the city. "You know what I was thinking about today?" Emma asked. "What?" "That interview. 7 years ago. When you asked me if personal problems would affect my work performance, and I lied and said no." Alexander smiled. "You didn't lie. Your personal problems never affected your work performance. You were the best secretary I ever had." "I was your only good secretary," Emma teased. "You fired everyone else." "Fair point," Alexander conceded. "But you were still the best." They stood together in comfortable silence, both reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. Emma thought about the terrified single mother she'd been, desperate and exhausted and certain she was failing at everything. Alexander thought about the cold, ruthless businessman he'd been, measuring his worth in profit margins and power. "If you could go back," Emma asked, "and tell that version of yourself, the one about to interview me, one thing, what would it be?" Alexander thought about it seriously. "I'd tell him that he's about to meet the woman who will change everything, and that he should pay attention from the very first day because she's going to teach him what success actually looks like." "And if you could tell that version of me something," Alexander pulled her closer, "I'd tell her that she's stronger than she knows, that she's going to save her son, that she's going to build a career she's proud of, and that she's going to find love in the last place she ever expected to look." Emma tilted her face up to kiss him. "I love you, Alexander Chen. Best decision I ever made taking that interview." "Best decision I ever made hiring you," Alexander replied. "Well, second best. The best was falling in love with you." Inside the apartment, Grace let out a small cry. Lucas's door opened immediately. He still woke at the slightest sound from his sister, and they heard his soft voice soothing her back to sleep. "It's okay, Gracie. Big Brother's here. I've got you." Alexander and Emma looked at each other and smiled. Their family, built from desperation, struggle, and unexpected love. Not perfect. Families never are, but theirs. And that made it absolutely perfect in all the ways that actually mattered. "Come on," Emma said, taking Alexander's hand. "Let's check on them." They walked inside together, toward the sound of their children, toward the life they'd built from nothing, toward a future that once seemed impossible and now seemed inevitable. Because sometimes the best stories are the ones that start with desperation and end with grace. Sometimes the best families are the ones you build rather than the ones you're born into. And sometimes the person you hire to organize your calendar ends up organizing your entire life in ways you never imagined. Emma Torres came to Chen Technologies 7 years ago looking for health insurance and a paycheck. She found a family. Alexander Chen hired her looking for someone to manage his schedule. He found purpose, love, and the life he'd been too blind to realize he was missing. Neither of them could have predicted it. Neither of them could have planned it. And neither of them would change a single thing about how it happened, because this is what they learned. The best things in life aren't the ones you chase. They're the ones that find you when you're not looking. They're the moments when everything changes because someone walks into your office needing a job and walks out having changed your life forever. This is the story of Alexander and Emma, of Lucas and Grace, of a family built from love and struggle and second chances, of a billionaire CEO who learned that true power isn't about control, it's about surrender, of a struggling single mother who learned that asking for help isn't weakness, it's courage, This is the story of two people who met at the wrong time, under difficult circumstances, and discovered that sometimes the wrong circumstances lead to exactly the right life, and they lived it, together, imperfectly, beautifully, completely. What did you think of Alexander and Emma's story? Rate it from 0 to 10 in the comments below. My favorite moment was when Alexander showed up at the hospital and told Emma cost didn't matter, that whatever Lucas needed he would get. That's when you knew he'd changed completely. What was your favorite moment? If this story touched your heart, subscribe to Deep Stories, stories that move you.